I have been asked, more times than I can count now, what the dark planet smells like. It is always the first question. Every new arrival stumbles through the intake corridor, with the tranquilizer still blurring the edges of their vision, collar already locked at the throat. And before they can get their bearings in the blue-white glare of the cell block, they look at me. Because I am the one who has been here the longest, the one who knows the layout of every hallway, and the shift rotation of every guard. And they ask me what the dark planet smells like, as though the smell of it will help them understand something, as though there is a single sensory detail that explains why every ship that ever answered that SOS frequency never came back. The answer is burnt synthetic fiber, processed corn oil, and a particular kind of cleaning solution they use on the concrete floors that I have since identified as the compound known in the broader galaxy as a mild neurotoxic irritant, which may or may not be deliberate. That is what the dark planet smells like. I have smelled it for 11 years. I was not supposed to be here this long. None of us were. My name is Thurman. Before Area 51, I held the chair of Xenobiological Systems at the Kreth Institute on my home world, a position I had spent 22 years building through peer-reviewed work on the evolutionary divergence of methane-breathing apex predators in the outer spiral. I was not a soldier. I was not an astronaut. I was a researcher who made the catastrophic error of believing that a distress signal from an uncontacted planet warranted academic investigation. I had read the scattered reports about the dark planet, the handful of long-range spectral surveys that had identified signs of organized electromagnetic activity, the theoretical papers about what it might mean if an uncontacted biosphere had independently developed radio transmission, and I believed, with the confidence of a man who has spent 2 decades studying living systems, that first contact warranted a careful scientific approach. I configured my personal survey craft for a 3-day orbital observation mission. I transmitted my coordinates to the Institute. I wrote a message to my department head explaining that I expected to be back before the end of the academic cycle. I wrote that message 11 years ago. I did not reach orbit. The humans were waiting. They are always waiting. That is the first thing you have to understand about them, the thing that the galaxy has never quite been able to absorb, despite the mounting evidence. They did not stumble into this. The distress signal from the dark planet is not a genuine distress signal. It is a broadcast, sustained and deliberate, calibrated to the emergency response frequencies of a dozen known spacefaring civilizations. It is a lure. It has subroutines that adapt the signal's harmonic signature based on the origin point of each incoming vessel. It identifies your species before you identify yourself. It finds the specific frequency your civilization has designated as an emergency call, and it mimics that frequency with a precision that leaves no margin for skepticism. I've analyzed the signal's architecture extensively since arriving here, using the mathematical modeling tools that the facility's computing systems provide to its prisoner engineers. And my prisoner engineers, that the signal represents approximately 60 to 80 years of iterative refinement. It did not begin as what it is now. Someone built it over a long time, studying how the galaxy responds to distress, learning how to make the response inevitable. The man who built the lure, the man who has been running Area 51 for the better part of 2 decades, is a creature of extraordinary and focused hatred. General Shanker. I have thought about him at some length over 11 years. I have had time to think about very little else. He is not, by his own civilization standards, a large man. Medium height, pale coloring, a prosthetic covering for his cranial loss that the other humans in his command pretend not to notice. He speaks quietly. He does not shout when things go wrong. This, I have come to understand, is the most dangerous thing about him, the quietness. The galaxy tends to expect its threats to announce themselves. Shanker does not announce himself. He builds the room around you before you realize you are in it. The room he has built at Area 51 is a considerable achievement by any engineering standard. The containment architecture alone, the collar system, the tiered access controls, the sensor grid that covers every surface bay and access corridor and crawl space in the facility, represents years of iterative design. Nothing in it is accidental. The intake protocol, the sequencing of the initial cell assignment and the collar fitting and the first interrogation has been tuned to produce a specific psychological state in the arriving alien. Competent, threatened, and without visible options. Not broken. Shanker does not want broken. Broken does not innovate. What he wants is a mind that is still fully functional, but has concluded, through a complete survey of its available options, that cooperation is the only rational path. He has been very successful at producing that state. I produced it myself, within approximately 6 weeks of arrival. I am not ashamed of this. The calculation was, at the time, correct. Options I could see were gently the options that were available to me. That is the nature of a well-constructed trap. It is not that you fail to think clearly inside it. It is that thinking clearly inside it produces the conclusion that the trap wants you to reach. He lost his father to a gray species scout ship when he was 11 years old. That is the origin, the wound that became a program. By the time I arrived on the dark planet, he had been running his program for 16 years. By the time I had been in Area 51 for 11 years, the program had a name, a budget line hidden inside 3 layers of human government appropriation, and a reactor large enough to sterilize a planet. Theo arrived 9 years ago. She is a cyclops, not in the pejorative sense, but literally, a single ocular organ spanning most of the upper facial structure, yellow-arized, with a threat display reflex that tends to make the guards nervous. She came from a rescue mission. An actual rescue mission sent by her government when my survey craft failed to return. They sent her because she was their best. She was their best navigational systems engineer and their most experienced deep space operative. And she had cleared 41 documented extractions in her career before she came to the dark planet. She was also their most obvious, which is why she lasted approximately 4 hours in atmosphere before the sensor arrays Shanker had built into the desert floor picked up her descent signature. I have thought about those 4 hours. Io does not talk about them often, but over 9 years of the cell block she has said enough that I have a rough outline. She entered atmosphere and immediately identified something wrong with the signal source, an irregularity in the frequency pattern that did not match genuine emergency protocols. She spent 90 minutes in orbit trying to verify the anomaly, second-guessing herself because the signal was so well constructed, so close to real. She was a rescue operative who had spent 20 years answering distress calls, and she had never once failed to answer one. She could not process the possibility that the call was a plot trap, because her entire professional identity was built on the assumption that distress calls are real. Shanker had studied rescue operatives. He knew exactly how to build a signal that a rescue operative cannot walk away from. Io understands this now. She has understood it for most of 9 years. She carries the understanding the way you carry a scar. Present at all times, impossible to remove. Something you have integrated because the alternative is worse. Doc arrived 6 years ago. He is small, gray-furred, with the quick, precise movements of a species that evolved in tunnel systems. He was a field medic on an Explorer-class vessel that intercepted the frequency on a long-range survey run. His captain ordered him not to answer it. He answered it anyway, because the signal had a specific harmonic in it that matched a genuine emergency tone from his homeworld, and he believed someone had modified it deliberately to call specifically to his people. He was correct. They had. Shanker's signal learns. It had been tracking Doc's civilization's emergency frequencies for 3 years. By the time Doc's ship came within range, and it adapted the broadcast specifically to the harmonic signature most likely to override a field medic's professional caution. Doc does not talk about that either. He told me once, and I did not ask again. There is a particular kind of guilt that comes from being manipulated through your best qualities, and I have learned not to probe it unnecessarily. That is how carefully Shanker's program is built. The signal adapts. It has subroutines. It learned. The 3 of us, Io, Doc, and I, had been in the cell block together long enough to have stopped asking each other questions we already knew the answers to. We had also, by necessity and under significant duress, designed and partially fabricated for General Shanker the following technologies: a portable atmospheric recycler, a compact quantum communications array, a soil remediation compound for the strip mining operations. His organization ran in the Northern Territories, the beat, and the foundational architecture of a data compression algorithm that the humans had since commercialized and were selling to each other at considerable profit. In exchange, Shanker had given us nothing. The deal he described, cooperation in exchange for eventual release, was not a deal. It was a management technique. We were the engine, he was the engineer. The collar at the throat was the throttle. I do not tell the new arrivals all of this on the first day. There is a sequencing to it. You give them the smell first, then the layout, then you let them understand the collar. The rest comes in time. The day the brothers arrived, I was in the fabrication bay, running a second stress test on the thermal housing for a component that Shanker's engineers had originally specced at tolerances that would have caused catastrophic failure within 600 operational hours. I had been quietly speccing it to tolerances that would cause catastrophic failure within approximately 40 because I am a scientist and some forms of resistance are expressed in decimal places. I did not know, at that moment, that today would be different. The fabrication bay looked the same as it always did. The lights were the same blue-white. The floor smelled the same. The guard rotation was on its ordinary schedule. Then the alarm sounded, which was not unusual. The alarms sound every time a new ship enters atmosphere. What was unusual was that they sounded twice 40 minutes apart. 2 ships, 2 arrivals in a single day. I set down my calibration tool and listened. The first one they brought in fast. I could hear it in the boot cadence of the escort team, the specific rhythm of 6 guards moving quickly with something that was fighting them. Then a door and then quiet. The second one came slower, 2 guards relaxed pace. Tch. Whatever had arrived in the second ship was not fighting. I filed that away and went back to my thermal housing and my 40-hour tolerances. Met them both for the first time in the cell block common area at evening meal distribution, which is the one time in a given day when all of us occupy the same space without a partition between us. First one was impossible to miss. I had encountered the name before. Scorch Supernova, from the planet Bab, head of their Bassa field operations, the most decorated active-duty astronaut in the Babian public record. His image had appeared in 2 of the xenobiological survey documents I'd reviewed before my own mission, largely because his rescue operations in the outer territories had generated significant biological disturbance data in the areas he'd passed through. He was large, blue-pigmented, with the broad musculature of a species that evolved in high-gravity coastal environments. He was also, within 40 minutes of arrival, already in a loud dispute with 3 of Shanker's guards about the structural inadequacy of the cell he had been assigned. The guards were not engaging with the argument. They never do. The collar handles that. I watched him for a while and recognized the type. The galaxy is full of decorated field commanders who have never once spent a sustained period in a situation they could not muscle through. They are valuable. Such people, within the operational envelopes they are designed for. Area 51 is not inside any of those envelopes. Area 51 is specifically, deliberately, architecturally outside all of them. Shanker has had decades to tune this facility against exactly this type of arrival. Scorch was going to be very difficult for the next several weeks. The second one sat down across the common area table from me with his meal tray and looked at the food on it for a long moment without touching it. He was also blue, also Babian, clearly related to the field commander, same jaw structure, similar brow ridge, approximately 10 years older in bearing if not in fact. He was slender in the way that people who do desk work are slender, with the slightly compressed posture of someone who has spent most of his professional life at a console. His collar was the same as ours. He was looking at the food, not with disgust or fear, but with the specific attentiveness of someone who was already cataloging it, already building a mental file on the nutritional composition and what that told him about the local supply chain. "You're not from the field mission," I said. He looked up. "No," he said. "Mission control." I followed the field mission. "They let you enter atmosphere voluntarily?" He gave me a look that said the question, while technically accurate, was missing some important emotional context. "Voluntarily is a flexible term," he said. "My brother is in this facility." I looked across the room at Scorch Supernova, who was now explaining to a guard, with considerable animation, the precise way in which the guard's organizational hierarchy represented a systemic failure of meritocracy. "That's your brother," I said. "Yes," he said. You came to Area 51 to rescue him. Yes, he said again, with the same tone which I recognized after a moment, as the tone of a person who had asked himself the same incredulous question multiple times already during the journey, and had not yet arrived at a satisfying answer. His name was Gary Supernova. He did not have a rank equivalent to his brothers, because Bobian Mission Control did not carry rank in the same way the field divisions did. He was a director. He had been running mission control for BASA for 14 years. He had guided his brother through 47 successful operations in 11 years, providing the navigational data, the structural analysis, the atmospheric modeling, the tactical alternatives that made each mission survivable, and had received, by his own account, approximately none of the operational credit for any of them. I let him eat for a while before I said anything else. Then I told him about the smell. Shanker came for Hiriki the next morning. I know the shape of Shanker's recruitment sessions because I have been through one, and Doc has been through one, and Io has been through one, and we have compared notes at some length. Comes in person. He sits across from you. He explains, with remarkable patience, the situation. He does not threaten. He does not raise his voice. He describes the reactor, its operational parameters, its current construction status, and what it is intended to do. He describes the deal. Your expertise in exchange for your brother's comfort, your brother's continued consciousness, your brother's life. Gary came back from that session and sat down in the cell block and looked at the wall for approximately 2 hours. Gave him the 2 hours. Then I sat down next to him. He wants the reactor completed, I said. Yes. He told you what it does. Yes. And he told you that if you refuse, Scorch goes into the freezing chamber. Gary looked at me. He told me that if I cooperate, Scorch comes out of the freezing chamber. He put him in before he made the offer. That's how he opens the negotiation. I had not known that detail. After 11 years sang still sound fiddle, shank and shlum to show me something new about how he operated. I sat with that for a moment. What are you going to do? I asked. Gary was quiet for a while. Then he said, fix the reactor. I felt the particular flatness that comes with an answer you expected and did not want. Then Bab dies, I said. And whatever planet he targets next, I know, Gary said. Is your brother's life worth? I know, he said again, and the second time it was quieter than the first. And it was not an answer to my question. It was a door closing on a room I had not been invited into. I let it go. I have been here long enough to know when a person is not finished thinking. He started on the reactor the following morning. Shanker's engineering team gave him access to the fabrication bay, which meant I was present for most of the first week. I observed him work. I do this. It is a professional reflex, the observational stance of a man who has spent his life studying systems. And what I observed over those first several days was not what I expected. He worked slowly. That was the first thing. A man whose brother was frozen at Shanker's discretion, whose homeworld faced destruction, whose entire situation demanded urgency. He worked with a careful, methodical pace that looked, from a distance, like a man who was not particularly troubled by his situation. He took measurements twice where once would have been sufficient. He reviewed documentation that was not directly relevant to the component in front of him. He paused regularly, not in the manner of someone stuck, but in the manner of someone who has reached a decision point and is allowing the decision to complete before proceeding. This pace visibly frustrated Shanker's engineering team. They were accustomed to productive desperation, to the quality of output that comes from a mind under sustained pressure, working fast because the alternative is painful. Gary did not produce that quality of output, produced something that looked, to Shanker's team, like compliance at below acceptable speed. I watched two of the engineers consult about it on the third day, reviewing the work Gary had completed, and finding it technically sound, but wondering aloud why it was taking this long. They concluded that he was afraid, that the fear was slowing his processing. They were not paying close enough attention to see what the slowness actually was. He also asked questions, constant, quiet questions. Not about the reactor's core specifications. Those he appeared to have absorbed in the first day. He asked about the power routing, the load distribution across the facility, the timing intervals on the security lockdowns, the specific frequency range of the collar signal transmitters. He asked these questions of everyone around him. The guards, the engineers Doc, when Doc came in to check on the thermal housing work, me when I was calibrating tolerances. He asked them as side questions, incidental questions, the kind that don't read as intelligence gathering because they are folded inside legitimate technical inquiries. It took me 4 days to recognize what he was doing. I recognized it not because I was particularly perceptive, but because I had spent 22 years in academic research environments, where the practice of embedding the question you actually want answered inside that sounds like something else entirely is a standard professional skill. It is how you ask a colleague about their methods without implying criticism. It is how you identify a gap in the literature without appearing to challenge the authority of the work that left the gap. It is the grammar of inquiry in environments where direct questioning creates resistance. Gary spoke that grammar fluently. He had been speaking it, I realized, since he arrived. Every incidental question was a survey instrument. Every pause was data collection. He was not building a reactor. He was building a map. I had been adjusting thermal tolerances to cause a specific failure at a specific operational hour. Gary was doing something considerably more comprehensive. I did not say anything to him about it directly. The walls in the fabrication bay have sensors, not acoustic. We had established that early on, but visual. And there are things that should not be said within the visual range of a sensor, even if the audio is clean. What I did instead was move my workstation 6 inches to the left, which positioned it slightly behind the angle of the primary overhead sensor, and I increased the frequency of my presence in the bay, and I began, in the second week, asking my own quiet questions. Of the guards, of the engineers, of the facility's own automated systems, which are less attentive than they should be about what they display to a xenobiologist who has had 11 years to learn how their software interfaces are structured. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters to the record. I am not a brave individual. I am a researcher. I spent 22 years building a career on careful observation and documented analysis. I did not come to Area 51 to fight anyone. I came because I made a mistake about what a distress signal meant, and I have been paying for that mistake every day in the smell of burnt synthetic fiber and processed corn oil. In 11 years, I had engaged in exactly one act of active resistance: the thermal tolerances, the 40-hour failure window, and I had done it so cautiously that it barely qualified as resistance. It was more of a strongly worded footnote, but I had also spent 11 years watching people arrive at Area 51 and get absorbed into it, watching Shanker's program grind them down into components, watching the galaxy's best and brightest become the fuel for a machine aimed at the galaxy's destruction. And watching Gary Supernova work in that fabrication bay, I felt something that I had not felt in a very long time. It was not hope exactly. It was something more precise than hope. It was the recognition of a pattern that I had not seen before, in a system I had thought I understood completely. Shanker's program had a flaw. The flaw was this: Shanker filtered for the obvious. His lure was calibrated for field commanders. The Scorch type, bold and responsive and visually impressive. The kind of arrival that generated a clean action and capture arc. His containment system was optimized for the same profile. The freezing threat, the collar, the force architecture of the cell block. All of it was tuned against someone who would try to overpower his way out. And it worked. I had watched it work for 11 years. Gary was not that profile. Gary was the person who had run the numbers behind 47 successful missions without ever being the primary visual subject of any of them. Gary was the person whose professional life had consisted of solving problems that his more prominent partner didn't know existed until Gary had already fixed them. Shanker had cataloged Scorch in his intake files. He had cataloged Gary as the leverage, the brother, the secondary capture, the emotional mechanism for extracting compliance from the field commander. He had looked at Gary and seen a hostage negotiation. He had not seen mission control walk into his facility. In the third week, I began to understand the specific shape of what Gary was building. It was not sabotage, not in the crude sense. It was something more architectural. He was restructuring the reactor's output sequencing in a way that would, when triggered, not simply fail but cascade, producing a feedback pulse through the facility's power grid that would, among other effects, neutralize the collar signal transmitters for a window of approximately 8 minutes. He had also, over the course of the first 2 weeks, identified the exact physical path through the facility that would be clear during that window, based on the security rotation patterns he had absorbed from his incidental questions. He had not, as far as I could tell, told his brother any of this. I understood why, when I thought about it. Scorch was many things, but subtle was not among them. Any plan that required Scorch to hold a secret was a plan that needed Scorch to not know the secret until the moment it mattered. I told Io. I did it in the common area, during the 30-minute period, when the monitoring is handled by a rotating guard pair rather than a fixed position, which meant the visual coverage had a gap in the northwest corner of the room near the water distribution station. I had mapped this gap in my second month at the facility and had never used it for anything until now, because there had never been anything to use it for. I led her there under the pretense of a conversation about the water distribution schedule, which is a topic sufficiently mundane that the guards do not attend to it with any particular vigilance. I told her the outline, the reactor, the cascade, the 8-minute window, the path. Did not tell Heller what I thought the odds were, because I am a scientist and I had run the calculation and the result was not encouraging. She listened without changing her expression, which is its own skill when you have a single large eye that communicates most of your emotional state involuntarily. Then she said, "Does Gary know you know?" "I believe so," I said. "He moved his workstation." She thought about that. "Doc, I'll tell him tonight." She nodded once slowly. "What do you need from me?" "The guards who cover the East Corridor during shift transition have a behavioral pattern," I said. "When there is noise, sustained, attention-drawing noise, from the common area, one of them moves to observe it, and the other stays at position. One guard on the East Corridor for approximately 4 minutes instead of 2. Io looked at me. I did the thing it does when she is considering something. She finds mildly distasteful. "You want me to make noise. You are very good at it," I said. She was quiet for a moment. 4 minutes. 4 minutes, I confirmed. She said something under her breath in her native language that I will not reproduce here, because the translation involves several concepts that do not exist in interstellar common, but the general tenor was, "Fine." I told Doc that night. He received the information with the focused stillness of a field medic evaluating a wound, which is to say he did not react visibly at all until he had processed it completely. And then he said, "The freezing chamber, which is still in it. The cascade will also release the chamber locks," I said. "It releases everything on the facility's power grid. The chamber is on that grid." Doc looked at me for a long moment. "Gary planned for that." "Yes," I said. "He planned for it without knowing whether we knew what he was doing, without knowing whether anyone would be positioned to help him." "Yes." Doc was quiet again. Then he said, "He planned for it because he planned for the possibility that one of us might figure it out." I had not explicitly framed it to myself in those terms, but when Doc said it, I recognized it as correct. Gary had not been building a solo escape plan. He had been building an escape plan that could absorb assistance if it was offered, without requiring that assistance to be there if it wasn't. He had left the architecture open. 14 years of mission control, 47 operations. The man had long experience with the problem of making a plan that could survive contact with operators who didn't know they were part of the plan. Shanker called Gary in on the morning of the 21st day to assess the reactor's progress. I was in the fabrication bay when Gary came back. He sat down at his workstation and ran 2 calibration sequences in silence, and then he looked at me and said, "He wants a demonstration in 2 days." I kept my hands on my own work. "How much of it is finished?" "Enough," Gary said. It was a single word, and it was also the most information he had directly shared with me about the reactor in 3 weeks of working 5 meters apart. I did not press him on it. I thought about what Doc had said. He planned for the possibility that one of us might figure it out, and I understood that Gary was not going to confirm or deny the architecture of what he was building, because confirming it created a liability. If I knew explicitly, I could be used to extract the information. What he was giving me instead was a timestamp, 2 days. I spent the rest of that day working on a secondary piece of information I had been developing for the past week, which concerned the location of Scorch's impounded ship. Shanker's team had moved it to a surface bay, approximately 400 meters north-northeast of the main facility entrance, which was inside the security perimeter but outside the primary building structure. I had identified this from the routing manifests visible on the facility's logistics terminals, which the guards treat as administrative background noise and do not restrict access to because they have never needed to. None of us had anywhere to go with that information before. 2 days. I told Gary about the ship's location that evening. I told him by mentioning, in a conversation that was technically about the calibration specs for a thermal component, that the environmental survey data I had reviewed, it suggested that the northern surface bays of the facility had favorable thermal dispersion characteristics for a Babian drive signature. I said it in the way you say a thing when you are not saying a thing, and Gary looked at me for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise and was not quite gratitude and was something more specific than either. The expression of someone who's been running the numbers on a problem and just received a data point that confirmed a suspicion rather than resolved an uncertainty. He nodded once. Then we talked about the thermal component. That night I did not sleep. This is not unusual. I rarely sleep well in the facility, but this was a different kind of sleeplessness. I lay in the cell block and listened to the specific silence of a facility whose 12-hour cycle had shifted into its night mode configuration, which is quieter but not empty. And I thought about Shanker's program. I thought about the 16 years of it. I thought about the lure and the intake and the fabrication work and the steady patient harvesting of the galaxy's intellectual capacity, civilization by civilization, signal by signal. I thought about what the reactor was meant to do. I thought about Bab. I thought about him, who had spent 14 years being the invisible part of his brother's famous career, the mission control that everyone forgot about, the voice in the earpiece that the cameras never showed. And I thought about what that kind of career does to a person's relationship with visibility. I thought about how a man like that might approach a situation in which being overlooked was not a problem to be solved, but an asset to be used. I thought about the particular efficiency of being underestimated, how it creates space, how it provides time, how it means the people who could stop you are directing their attention and resources somewhere else. I had experienced the opposite of this for 11 years. I had been assessed correctly as a scientist, cataloged as a useful technical resource, monitored at a level of attention that was sufficient to prevent the kind of obvious resistance I might have attempted. Shanker's program is good at assessing what it expects to find. It is less good at assessing what it does not think to look for. Shanker had looked at Gary and seen a hostage negotiation. The galaxy had looked at Gary and seen Scorch's brother. I had looked at Gary for 3 weeks, and I had seen it for 3 weeks. What I had seen on the eventual life for my on and Procurdio in the common area when he studied the food on his tray with that careful, cataloging attention. A scientist. Not by training, perhaps, but by the deepest habit of his professional mind. A man who, when placed in an unfamiliar system, does not try to overpower the system or escape the system, but instead spends his first available hours building a complete model of the system in his head. A man who, once he has the model, starts identifying which components of the system can be redirected. That is what Shanker's program had never encountered before. Not because such people don't exist. They do, in every civilization. But because Shanker's lure was calibrated to catch the obvious ones, and the obvious ones are never this type. This type doesn't answer distress signals. This type stays home and runs mission control. Gary hadn't come because of the signal. Gary had come because his brother was here. And that, I understood in the sleepless dark of the cell block, was the thing that Shanker's program had no counter for. Every variable in the program was calibrated against alien species responding to a broadcast. It had no architecture for alien species responding to family. The morning of the demonstration, the fabrication bay had more of Shanker's engineering staff present than usual. They stood along the walls and watched. Shanker himself arrived at the bay at 084 by the facility's clock, with 2 of his senior staff, and the particular brand of quiet that he carries with him the way other people carry noise. He positioned himself at the center of the bay, not at the reactor, and watched Gary approach the console. I was at my own workstation in my usual position, slightly behind the primary sensor angle, the position I had moved to 3 weeks ago, which Shanker's team had never asked me to change because I was not the person they were watching. Kept my hands on my calibration work. I kept my face oriented toward my work. I kept my breathing at the rate that, for my species, is associated with baseline non-agitation. I have had 11 years to practice keeping my face out of the record. Gary ran 3 preliminary sequences. His hands were steady. I had watched those hands for 3 weeks, and they had been steady the entire time. Through every moment of the quiet engineering work, through every incidental question, through every calculation performed, in plain sight of people who were not watching carefully enough. They were steady now, Shanker said. Show me what it does. Gary said, all right. He activated the primary sequence. I want to describe the next 40 seconds carefully, because they are the ones I have reviewed the most often in the 3 years since, reconstructing them from what I observed and what I was told later, and what the physical evidence confirmed. The reactor fired. The core engaged at the specified parameters. The engineering staff watched their readouts and made sounds that suggested the outputs were correct. Shanker watched Gary. Gary watched the console. Approximately 20 seconds. Everyone in that room saw what they expected to see. The reactor performing to spec. The output curves were correct. The energy readings were nominal. The engineering staff were beginning to relax into the satisfaction of a system behaving exactly as designed. This is, I have since concluded, the most significant 20 seconds of the entire operation. Not the cascade, not the collar dropping, not the escape through the North Corridor. 20 seconds, when the reactor performed correctly. Because those 20 seconds were not incidental to Gary's plan, they were central to it. He needed Shanker's team to see a working reactor. He needed them to see it clearly enough to believe it completely, to have that belief in their hands when the secondary sequence fired. A system failure in the first 5 seconds reads as sabotage. A system that runs correctly for 20 seconds and then fails reads as a technical error. At least for the additional seconds it takes someone to recategorize it. Those seconds are what the cascade needed to propagate without active human countermeasures. Gary had planned for those 20 seconds the way he planned for everything. Quietly, from the outside in, by understanding exactly what the people watching him needed to see before they could be surprised. Then Gary's hands moved to a secondary panel, and he ran a sequence that was not in the demonstration protocol. The cascade took 12 seconds to propagate through the power grid. I know this because I counted. In those 12 seconds, the reactor's output feeding back through the grid produced, in sequence, a surge in the primary distribution hub, a fault in the relay system covering the eastern and northern corridors, a complete dropout of the transmitter array covering the collar signal, and 7 seconds into the cascade, the sequential unlocking of every powered lock in the facility, including the freezing chamber in sublevel C. The collar at my throat went silent. After 11 years, the absence of its constant low-frequency pressure was so abrupt that for a moment I could not process it. I sat still and let my nervous system understand what had happened, and then I picked up my calibration tool and I stood up. Aya was already moving. She had spent 2 days identifying exactly when to move and had used none of it on noise. She had used all of it on positioning. She was through the fabrication bay's side exit before the first of Shanker's engineering staff understood that the collar signal was gone. Doc was in the cell block corridor. He had been in position since 0835. The fabrication bay, there was a period of approximately 3 seconds, during which the engineering staff and Shanker's 2 senior staff stood looking at their readouts and trying to understand what the fault indicators were telling them. Shanker himself stood looking at Gary. Gary stood at the console and did not move. Shanker said very quietly, "What did you do?" It was not a question. The syntax was interrogative, but the tone was the flat statement of a man who already knew the answer and was asking only because the form required it. Gary said, "I fixed your reactor. It's destroying itself." "Yes," Gary said. "That's how I fixed it. I was through the exit by then. I did not see what happened immediately after. What I know from Doc's account and from physical evidence is that in the following 2 minutes, Shanker attempted to use his collar override device, discovered it was non-functional, attempted to seal the facility, discovered the seals were disengaged, and ordered his remaining staff to manual containment positions. Manual containment against a facility full of aliens whose collars were offline and who included, in their number, a Cyclops with an 11-year store of suppressed aggression and a very large operative range, took approximately 4 minutes to completely fail. We were in the North Corridor when Scorch found us. He came through the sub-level C access corridor at a speed that suggested he had woken from the freezing chamber and immediately started moving without fully consulting his nervous system first, which is consistent with what I know about his operational profile. He was disoriented, combat-ready, and extremely loud in that order. He was also, I noticed, cataloging the corridor around him with the automatic environmental scanning of a man who has spent his professional life entering unfamiliar spaces and identifying the fastest way through them. Whatever his limitations as a planner, his spatial processing was exceptional. He had the exit angles mapped before he finished decelerating. He collided with his brother in the corridor and the resulting exchange, which I observed from a position approximately 4 meters away while Doc monitored the north access point, involved a significant amount of physical contact and vocal output that I will characterize for the record as emotionally substantive. It lasted approximately 45 seconds, which is a long time to spend on a reunion in an actively compromised facility. But I have observed enough biological species under duress to understand that certain communications cannot be compressed further without losing what they are trying to transmit. The brothers needed 45 seconds. They took 45 seconds. Then Scorch looked up and found me standing there. "Who are you?" he said. "Thurman," I said. "I've been here 11 years, we're leaving." He looked at his brother. Gary said, "Yes, we are." Scorch looked around at the corridor, the open lock mechanisms, the offline sensor panels. He looked at his brother again, with an expression that was moving, visibly and rapidly, from confusion to something much more complicated. The expression of a man who is used to being the one who does the rescuing, confronting the evidence that he has been rescued. I recognized it as a significant psychological moment for him, and made a note of it professionally. Then filed it away because we had approximately 6 minutes of collar offline window remaining. Said, "You did this," Gary said, "mostly." The qualifier was precise. Gary had done the architecture. The rest of us had done the execution. Scorch looked at me, and then at Doc, and then back at his brother with the expression of a man who is revising a model he has held for a long time, and I could see the revision happening in real time. The recalibration of what his brother actually was, as opposed to what the record had said he was. It was, from a xenobiological standpoint, a fascinating process to observe. It was also taking time we did not have. 4 minutes, I said. Scorch nodded. He had good instincts, whatever else you could say about him. He did not ask for elaboration. He turned toward the north access point and we moved. The ship was where the logistics manifest said it would be, 400 meters north-northeast, in the surface bay. Getting to it required crossing 400 meters of open terrain that was still partially staffed by Shanker's personnel. But Doc had identified, over the same 3 weeks that Gary had been working in the fabrication bay, that the terrain senses into the northwestern approach had a coverage gap on the deck level that resulted from an installation error made approximately 4 years ago and never corrected. Challenge because the error was small enough to pass automated inspection and required a specific vantage point to identify. Doc had that vantage point because his workstation in the cell block faced northwest, and he had 11 years to look at it. We used the gap. There were 8 of us in total. I.O., Doc, myself, Gary, Scorch, and 3 others who had been in the cell block long enough to know, the moment the collar signal dropped, exactly what it meant and exactly what to do. We moved quickly and without debate, and we reached the surface bay in 11 minutes, which is faster than I had projected because Scorch carries a great deal of the group's momentum. Once he has a direction to move in, I will give him that. Whatever his deficiencies as a subtle operator, He is extremely useful when the requirement is simply to move fast. Getting the ship off the ground took 4 minutes. I spent those 4 minutes at the port observation window watching the facility's exterior. Because I needed to see what Shanker was doing, and because I had learned, over 11 years, that what Shanker does in a crisis is always instructive. What Shanker did was Commander Scorch's suit. The powered exo-armor they had taken from him on intake and stored in the equipment bay, and use it to attempt an interceptions before we cleared atmosphere. I know this because I saw him emerge from the facility's emergency roof access in the suit, with 2 of his personnel in light craft flanking him, and I know what the suit's tractor capability is from the spec documentation that Gary had reviewed during the reactor work. What happened next? I could not see clearly from the port window. What I know from the accounts of others is that Scorch went out to meet him, and Gary followed, and the 2 of them dismantled Shanker's tractor hold through a combination of methods that I am told involved a great deal of improvisation and some significant structural damage to the suit, after which Shanker fell and was caught. Not because anyone wanted to catch him, but because the alternative was an outcome that none of them, not even IIO after 11 years, was willing to be responsible for. They are a complicated species. The galaxy has never quite gotten the measure of it. We look at the obvious ones, the Shankers, the heavily armed and motivated and militarily organized, and we think we see humanity. We think we see a xenophobic apparatus built on fear and strategic deception, and we do. That is there, that is real. The lure is real. The reactor was real. The 11 years were real. Shanker is a human, and Shanker's program is a human program, built by human hands, and sustained by human bureaucratic infrastructure, and funded by human institutional resources. I do not want to diminish that. The galaxy should not diminish it. It should be afraid of it. Specifically and concretely in the way that one should be afraid of a precisely constructed trap that has already caught hundreds of the best minds in the quadrant. But Shanker is not the whole of humanity. And the galaxy's persistent error has been in treating the most visible part of a thing as though it were the entire thing. What was also real was the 7-Eleven convenience store owner named Hawk and his colleague Hammer, 2 humans who had encountered Gary in the minutes before his capture, who had given him a cold drink and a moment of straightforward kindness with no operational reason to do so, and who, when the situation resolved, had come to the surface bay and helped us get the ship's external coupling aligned. They had been tranquilized during Gary's capture and had regained consciousness sometime during the Cascade event. They had found themselves in a facility with offline locks and no one giving them orders, and their response to that situation, unconstrained, unprompted, operating purely from whatever values they had arrived with, had been to find the people who needed help and to help them. I did not understand why they were there until Io told me later that Gary had asked them, quietly, in the brief window before Shanker's people arrived at the store, whether they knew where the impounded ships were kept. They had. They had told him. And when the facility went offline, they had moved on their own, without being asked again, to the place where that information would be useful. 2 individuals, unaffiliated with any government or military structure, operating on nothing but personal judgment and a sense that the people trying to get off this planet deserve to succeed. It is not possible to build a model of human behavior that produces Shanker and also produces Hawk and Hammer if the model assumes that one of those outputs is representative and the other is an anomaly. They are both representative. They are both real. They are both, apparently, what you get when you produce a species whose primary evolutionary advantage was the ability to cooperate flexibly with members outside their immediate social group. The cooperation sometimes produces Shanker's program. The cooperation also sometimes produces 2 men in a convenience store who don't know you and give you a cold drink and then show up when you need them. Shanker sees humanity as a weapon. He has spent 2 decades sharpening it against the galaxy, and he is not wrong about the edge it has. But he is wrong about the whole shape of the thing. A weapon has one function. Humanity has, as far as I can determine after 3 years of attempting to analyze the data from my 11 months of additional observation, before I finally left the dark planet, approximately as many functions as it has individuals. and it does not consistently produce the same result from the same inputs, and its threat modeling is therefore structurally incomplete in any formalization I have been able to construct. I find this, professionally, both fascinating and deeply unsettling. I filed my report with the Kreth Institute 14 months after returning home. It has since been cited in 7 subsequent academic papers on the subject of Earth contact protocols and in 2 governmental policy reviews in systems that had previously been considering responding to the signal. The Institute also convened a full faculty seminar on the architecture of Shanker's broadcast, which I attended, and which produced, among other outputs, a recommendation that the signal be actively jammed at the source. I do not know the current status of that recommendation. I know that the recommendation was made, and I know that implementing it would require approaching the dark planet. And I know what has happened to everyone who has approached the dark planet with a single ship and a clear objective. I try not to think too hard about the gap between those 2 facts. What I do know is what I know with certainty, which is the only kind of knowledge I have ever been willing to put in a file under my name. I know that for 11 years, the galaxy's best answer to the dark planet was to send its strongest, most famous, most visually impressive operatives in response to a signal designed to catch exactly that type. I know that for 11 years, this answer failed completely and consistently, and that the facility at Area 51 grew larger and better funded and more dangerous with each answer the galaxy gave it. I know that the answer that worked did not come from a field commander. It came from the person who ran the numbers behind the field commander. The person nobody was watching. The person who looked at a hostile system and, instead of trying to overpower it, spent 3 weeks building a complete model of it in his head. I know that Shanker never saw it coming. I know this because I watched his face in the fabrication bay in the moment after Gary told him how he had fixed the reactor, and what I saw was not rage and was not fear. It was the specific expression of a man who has spent 2 decades architecting a very elegant trap and has just encountered the one variable his model did not contain. He had planned for the field commanders. He had planned for the brave and the obvious and the motivated. He had planned for grief and for rage and for courage. He had not planned for patience. Gary Supernova stood in that fabrication bay for 21 days and was quiet and was thorough and was, to every eye that wasn't looking carefully, the compliant and manageable and non-threatening secondary capture, the hostage, the leverage. He was the person no one was watching. He was mission control. He was always mission control. And when the cascade went through the grid, and the collars went quiet, and 11 years of Shanker's program came apart in 12 seconds of feedback propagation, through a power distribution system that a careful, methodical, desk-working alien had been studying from the inside for 3 weeks. When all of that happened, the only person in that fabrication bay who was not surprised was Gary. I think about that sometimes, in the quiet. I think about the 11 years and the smells and the tolerances I had been adjusting by decimal places, and the slow grinding certainty that the program would continue, and that the galaxy would keep sending its obvious best and Shanker would keep absorbing them. Think about sitting down across that table from a man with a meal tray and a compressed posture, and the specific attentiveness of someone already building a mental file. And I think about the fact that it took the galaxy 11 years to send someone who looked at Area 51 the way a scientist looks at a problem. It should not have taken that long. That is what the record should say, in the end. Not that humanity is simple, or that they are easy, or that one operation in one facility represents the measure of their capability. They are not simple. General Shanker is still alive, and the program, in diminished form, still runs, and the galaxy would be foolish to confuse the dismantling of one lure with the dismantling of the architecture behind it. But the record should also say this. The galaxy sent its strongest for 11 years, and they were caught. And then it sent someone quiet, and he walked out. That is worth knowing. That is worth putting in the file. I have put it in the file.